Okay. Well, yeah, I think that's you watched it. I stopped watching at and about at the end of the break. It's good. I'll never get it on.
Did you give your talk yet, Jay?
Yes. No, they're not. They're educators, they're not.
Read it all, of course.
So I haven't even tried to answer this. Okay, you ready? Sorry.
Make sure this is on.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Okay, you're gonna go first.
Yes, I want to welcome actually your environmental horticulture extension agent for Alachua County and Newberry, and Cynthia Nazario-Leary. And she was scurrying around this morning. Their greenhouse blew over in Newberry last night. Apparently a downburst. She received her BS in landscape contracting from Penn State University, an MS in horticulture and Ph.D. in natural resources and environmental management from the University of Hawaii. Cynthia began working in extension as an urban horticulture agent for this University of Hawaii in Maui County. And after 20 years in Hawaii, she moved with her family to Gainesville, Florida in 2019. In her current IFAS extension position, she coordinates the Master Gardener Volunteer Program, implements Florida-friendly landscaping programs, and supports community and school gardening initiatives. And Cynthia aims to combine her extension experience with her passion for communicating science-based information to engage the community and affect positive change. And we welcome her this morning.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I was telling Bob I've had a moment to kind of calm down after both that exhilarating win last night, right? And then I had to go into work and deal with a blown over nursery. So I've had highs and lows. I wanted to preface this talk. So the talk that I typically give as an environmental horticultural extension agent for Alachua County is usually about gardening for pollinators. That's typically the title of this talk. And that's because there's been a strong interest by community groups, the public, HOAs, to establish pollinator gardens. And they want to know what to do. And so that talk has focused mostly on giving a basic overview about pollinators, the importance of pollinators, and then diving into those specific pollinators and plant design that you can do. So I wanted to share that with you as well, but with talking with Bob, you know, I wanted to add that this component of ecosystem services, which is an interest for me as an agent and as a scientist is I'm interested to know in these urban environments that we have, which in a way are a hodgepodge of different things, right? It's not a natural environment. It's not an agricultural environment. It's a very people-oriented environment. And so there's lots of different patches or a mosaic of different landscapes. How do those pollinators function in that? And how can we, knowing that information, how can we build better pollinator areas? And when I started to dive into it, I realized there's actually not a lot of research in urban environments when it comes to pollinators specifically. There's a lot of information about pollinator value in the agricultural sector, right? Because pollinators support our food system. And there's information about pollinators in their natural environments, right? Because many of our pollinators are endangered, especially our native ones. And so we've sought to find out, what's their native habitat and how can we use that information to also support them in our urban environments. But specifically for urban environments, there is a strong need for more information. So, but we have researchers at UF that are starting to look at this. Dr. Rachel Mallinger, she does a lot of work with pollination and insects, and she has several research papers. We also have Dr. Adam Dale at UF, who is looking at pollinator refuge in like turf environments. So think about golf courses or parks. So what you'll see is that I kind of have this ecosystem services value up front, and then we'll dive into the gardening for pollinators presentation. So you'll kind of see that transition. So why is this important, right? And it all comes back to urbanization. Basically, there's more people on the planet, and there's more people moving to cities. So 3.2 million hectares from 1900 to 2000, that's how much they grew in the US. And then in Florida, we have 4 of the nation's top 5 fastest growing metropolitan areas are here right in Florida. And we have 3 of the top 10 that have increased in the number of people. There's that statistic that gets thrown out a lot that, we have 1,000 people moving here every day, right? So that means that our urban environments are expanding. We have increased development. And that means that something's giving up, right? We're either taking agricultural land and turning it into an urban landscape, or we're taking forested or natural areas and converting them. So there is a need to understand how these land use changes are affecting pollinator health and abundance. So this is just wanted to include so you could get an idea of where these populations are increasing in Florida, mostly around the central and kind of southwest areas. And then this is a map that many of the agents we use in our Florida-friendly landscaping education when we're talking about water quality. But it's very pertinent for talking about pollinators as well, because it shows, this was a study done in 2010 to map the urban environments in Florida in the 2010. And then what they projected based on the development that was happening in 2010, they projected it out to 2070, and you see an increase in those red areas. And so when we talk about water quality, we're talking about, how can we maintain water for all those, for that population increase? But we also need to think about pollinators. If pollinators were in that green space, now we have a red space. We know that pollinators can live in urban environments, but how do we make those urban environments more amenable to pollinators? So a lot of times when we think about urban environments, it's in a negative context, right? In the conservation world, there's usually, the ones that want to preserve nature, which has a role, right? Preserving those native environments, or trying to preserve those areas, those natural areas. And then you have the folks that recognize that humans are also part of part of this, right? We can't, as much as sometimes we'd like to extract humans from certain areas, and I think there's a role in that. For the most part, humans exist on this planet as well, and so we have to find win-wins where we can have people and nature interacting. And what are those environments look like? And so despite the challenges and some of the issues that we have with urbanization and their impacts on pollinators, they also offer a lot of opportunities because many of the urban environments have green spaces, right? And then if you look at suburban areas, most of the properties have some sort of lawn or yard. And so what if we could take advantage of those green spaces to encourage and support pollinators? So it's not only a threat, but also an opportunity. And I am a glass half full girl, so I go for the opportunity. And that's, for me, what I would like to move forward with here in Florida, in Alachua County, is how can we create those opportunities for pollinator conservation right in our own backyards, right in our own communal spaces, our parks, and anywhere there's green spaces, roadsides, the like. So this was taken from an article. It was actually written about, it was a study in Spain, but I liked how they kind of created this graphic of our cities a threat or an opportunity for the conservation of pollinators. And basically what it comes down to is that because pollinators don't fly a very long ways, like you can actually get a lot from a small space, that it's really about making sure that they have space to have habitat. So we can create those environments within cities and support them. So are there enough of these urban green areas? And we'll dive into the urban green areas in another slide. What are the plant species that are present? We'll talk about the value of native species, but there's lots of non-native species that are also very important for pollinators and can provide those resources for the pollinators in the absence of native species, right? Especially if those native species can't grow in that area anymore, or they're just not able to be supported in that area. We can augment basically our native plants with non-native species as well. Oh, sorry, I realized some of that got cut off on there. Understanding the floral resources. We're gonna talk about that too, about how diverse are they, not only in the types of floral resources, but the seasonality of those floral resources. So throughout the year, do we have, we tend to focus as humans, we have our spring, right? Maybe in Florida, we also have a lovely fall when we can have some flowering plants. But pollinators need floral resources all year round. So that goes into that supply. And then what pollinator groups are attracted to these species? So we got the plant part, and then of course we have the pollinator part. What are the pollinators that are visiting? What do we see? Do we see more bees, wasps, butterflies? What proportion is native versus non-native? Right now there's a big discussion about, honeybees. Are they technically an invasive species? I don't think we're getting rid of honeybees at any time. I think they're here to stay. But they do have an impact in terms of if they're visiting and using floral resources, that is less floral resources for other pollinators. So kind of understanding who's visiting what and when. And then, are those the under-attracted pollinator groups? Are those pollinators that we need to maybe find out that they don't have enough resources? Our monarch butterfly is an example of that. Are we providing the right floral resources to support the monarch butterfly? So these urban green areas, this is really my area of interest right now because I feel like they're underutilized spaces. If you just go out and drive, you'll see, wherever you see lawn or wherever you see a ground cover, that's a potential urban green space that maybe we could put in to support pollinators. And they can often offer enough resources for pollinators. There's also been some research into how those green spaces, especially on the periphery of an urban area, could actually support agricultural areas, right? They become refuge not only for the pollinators within an urban area, but they can also help support the pollination of our agricultural crops. When we're thinking about these green spaces, we want to be mindful and purposeful in what we're putting out there. I was just at the Native Plant Conference this past weekend, and a great talk given by Dr. Gage LaPierre about he's interested in I want to say meadow restoration, because he's more looking at taking very disturbed areas that are infested with invasive species, mostly grasses, and then attempting to just put in some floral resources in there. He tried to focus on natives, but he basically went with what he could get established. And a lot of it was site prep, to be honest, which is, when it comes to establishing a lot of these things, site prep is going to be key. But he was intentional on the plants that he put there. He was thinking about what type of pollinators he wanted to attract, what was also going to work in that space. In Florida-friendly landscaping, we talk about right plant, right place. So he was thinking about that. He wasn't going to try and put something in there that wasn't going to serve the function of what he was trying to do. And I think that's something that we need to think about even for our own gardens, is understand what is the environment that we have, how do we want to use that environment, how do we want to experience it, and then with all those factors, what type of pollinators can we support? And then, of course, supporting research that is looking more now at our urban landscaping environments. We don't have a lot of information, even for pollinators, for water use, for composting, for soil amendments. There's so many things it's kind of been the forgotten area of research in terms of what do we have in our own backyards. Oops. Oh, so kind of continued with the urban green areas. As I mentioned, these are underutilized spaces, and that the research is starting to show that when we can use these areas, we can increase pollinator diversity, and that those increased pollinators, many of them also serve, especially with the flies, they can also serve for improved biological control. Basically, we're kind of adding balance back into a system, right? We're introducing some of those natural ecosystem functions, right? So that now you have better balance in these systems. And we can still do that with a multifunctional urban design, that it has to work for us too. I think, as much as we want to do things for plants, native plants, pollinators, ultimately, if they're going to be successful, people need to find value in them, and to find value when we use them or we use those spaces, it has to work for us. If it doesn't work for us, we tend to it won't succeed. So this was some of the research that I've started to dive into. And you guys are you're my first audience for this ecosystem services portion. So I'm still, I'll definitely be adding to this, but there's been some great studies looking at pollinators in different communities. And especially, like I said, I'm focused on this urban gardens and green spaces. So this one study estimated that 30 to 50% of the garden bee community contributes to pollination of nearby crops, as I was talking about those, especially if they're on the periphery or near agricultural areas. So one research agenda for these authors was looking at those ecosystem services in that they call it the peri-urban agriculture. So right when we're driving to Newberry, that's an excellent example of that peri-urban area, right? You have ranching, you have hay, and you have watermelon, and you have other specialty vegetable crops that are being grown right next to new developments, right, and shopping centers. So that would be a great environment to start looking at. Well, if we have some green spaces that we dedicate to supporting pollinators, how does that support the agriculture while also enhancing our urban environment that's expanding? And then Wagner in 2020 reviewed insect population declines and some increases. So this is where they're looking at the urban environments and they're seeing that it's not all negative. Sometimes you see declines in some species, but then there's other, it's just, you know, like squirrels. And what's the story about is the falcon in New York City that, you know, lives on the skyscrapers now. So there are, you know, insects and animals can adapt to our environments as well. And that's true for pollinators as well. So they noticed that there were some that actually were enhanced by urban environments. So there, it highlights the need, we need better monitoring. We need better data for understanding what are the pollinators that are visiting our backyards. And I'll mention it now because I don't know if I'll be able to get to it. I'm realizing this is probably going to take up most of my time, is that we do an annual pollinator census every year in August. It's part of, so Georgia was it started with Georgia, I think in 2018 or 2019 was their first census. And they use citizen science. They have people, they have a form, and you just basically sit for 15 minutes in your garden and you record everything that you see visiting, and they've really simplified it so that it's very easy. And Florida joined last year for the first time. So we now have data for that census, and that'll be in August. And we're going to do it again. And so we're part of this Southeast pollinator census that's going on. And the need for it is that we need to know what we have in our backyards. So then another study identified predicting impacts of plant species loss on pollinator networks as a major challenge. So, you know, some pollinators evolve with their plants, right? And so if you lose certain plant species, you're going to lose those pollinators as well. In my research in Hawaii, that was a big deal because in Hawaii, almost all of the native plants have a unique pollinator for them. And so that's why most of them are extremely endangered, because in many cases, their pollinator doesn't exist anymore. So they're being hand pollinated. And there's a great story of plants that were found on a cliff on Kauai. It's a cabbage plant. It's a really amazing plant, but it's got a tubular flower that's about this. The corolla is this long. So they think it was pollinated by a moth that had an extremely long proboscis. And they can't find any evidence of the moth anymore. So they hand pollinate it. But this plant is a really good container plant. And now it is very popular as a container plant for people's lanais and patios. So, you know, you got to find those good stories. And I know that that's something we can do here in Florida too. But we need to, again, always more data to understand that plant pollinator relationship and network in urban environments, because it's different, right? And then Dale et al., so this is Adam Dale here at UF, he found that replacing turf with wildflowers on golf courses increased native bees and natural enemies. And that enabled a healthier turf, right? Because they had less problems with the turf. Basically improve the biological control of caterpillar pests. And if you're involved with turf, you know that caterpillars can be a nightmare for managing turf. So by up to 50%. So that's pretty significant. If I was a turf or a golf course manager, I might pay attention to that. So this also came from the Journal of Applied Ecology. Now this is kind of shifting gears, now thinking about what are the things that we want to do, that we need? And then this is going to kind of transition us into the, you know, how do we do a garden for pollinators? And so they basically identified kind of these 5 aspects that you need to be able to successfully enhance pollinator habitats. So identifying the native and ornamental plants with diversity of species, morphology, and phenology. So this is looking at the plant part, making sure you have the right plants in the right place, and looking, I like how they included both natives and non-natives in there. Society acceptance and co-planning. I call this managing expectations. Often what we find with the pollinator gardens is there's a significant amount of people that think of them as very weedy, right, and not attractive. We also have a disconnect with the landscape companies who are then expected to manage these pollinator gardens or areas with native plants, not only in our communal areas, but if people decide to plant them in their backyard, but they want to hire somebody maintain it, those guys are not trained, guys and gals, are not trained to manage native plants. And to be honest, there's not a lot of information on how to manage native plants in your landscape. In terms of like, you know, on the scale of like, okay, if you had to develop a regimen, what would that regimen look like? Because that's what landscape contractors do, right? They come up with a regimen for how they're going to do your yard, and they have it built out for the year. We don't have that for our native landscapes, and especially ones that involve pollinators. Because if you're involving pollinators, you can't just spray whenever you want, right? It's a more adaptive management style. And I'll tell you right now, there's a lot of resistance to an adaptive management by these companies. They want a recipe that they can follow so they can know how to make money and budget for it better. So there's room there. And I'm the commercial agent, Dr. Tatiana Sanchez, and I, that's something that we want to work towards, is how can we bridge that that disconnect, or improve the connection between that. And then, okay, so that really kind of goes into the management. Supplements, what are the things that we can add that are, going to improve, from nest boxes, feeders, harking back to the native plant conference I was at. Actually, Dr. Rachel Mallinger gave a talk about, she was looking at pollinators in terms of like a fire regime that happens in natural areas. How does fire influence pollinators? And what she found was that if it gets too overgrown, then you don't have the ground nesting pollinators, ground nesting bees and wasps, because they depend on the fire to clear out the undergrowth, right? And so when we don't have that clearing out, then they can't nest in those areas. So, beyond burning our yards, which we don't encourage people to do, although my husband loves to torch, he uses the torch for weed control, but he's a weed scientist, so I'll let him do that. But I don't recommend, just fire in general is not something we want to generally recommend to the public. But what about mowing? Can we simulate? It's not going to be the same, it's not exact, but can we use mowing or other types of management practices to simulate some of these things that are occurring in nature in our urban environments that's safe for us and also supports them? And that all happens when we support that research that can make those connections. Looking at those nesting resources, I know there's, at UF2, there's I think a PhD student who was looking at a deadwood campaign. So encouraging people to leave some dead wood in their yards because they provide nesting opportunities for many of these pollinators. Oftentimes we forget that the pollinators that we see, that's the adult, right? It's not the immature or the different life stage of that insect. And so, for example, butterflies, when we see them, they're drinking nectar and they're so lovely, but they start out as caterpillars that eat what? What do caterpillars eat? Leaves, right? So if we want butterflies, we also have to expect that there's going to be a certain amount of herbivory and leaf chewing also on our plants. So understanding all the life cycles of those pollinators, their habitats, and then how we can modify that to really promote that in our environments. So this is kind of where we shift into the pollinator garden. So I might shift some slides. How are we on time, Bob? Because this is the first time I've done those slides, and I want to make sure I have enough time. 10:30? Okay, so about 20 more minutes, 25 more minutes. All right. Oh, not more than 20, okay, because we'll leave room for questions. So I might skip some slides just because, as I said, I spent a little bit more time on that, but I find that research really fascinating, and it's really, that is ongoing right now. That is where it is at for a lot of the urban and environmental horticulture right now. So this is what I tell the public. You know, instead of diving into the studies and everything, I just tell them it's important, and this is why it's important. We need to maintain flower diversity because pollinators support seed and food production and food for other wildlife. Why is it important? 90% of our flowering plants rely on animal pollinators. You don't have those animal pollinators, you don't get the flowers, and you don't get the fruit from the flowers. So over 200 species of animals are involved in pollination, and of course, you know, pollen leads to fertilization and fruit set. So we have 87 of 115 crops are pollinated, 35% of crop production worldwide, and 43% of our crops here in Florida depend on pollinators. And that's, again, going back to, okay, so we know that agriculture, we have 43% of our agriculture needs pollinators. Can we look at that environment between urban and agriculture and maybe create some refuge for those pollinators? We'll be supporting ag as well as our urban environments. And then we have the economic value. I mean, money talks. This is where people, you know, especially when we're writing our reports. So pollination, the ecological services of pollination by wild insects has been estimated at least 57 billion on the national level. And in Florida alone, the contribution, this is looking at ag crops, because unfortunately we don't have a monetary system for valuing the pollinator in your backyard. I've been trying to think of ways we could monetize it, but right now the way we monetize pollinators is their value for our food production. So it exceeds 50 million per crop per year in Florida for 7 of its most valuable crops. So pretty important for Florida. Continuing on, when I talk about the pollinators themselves, we are looking at they call it the next extinction, is of many of the insects, and many of those insects are our pollinators. We've definitely seen declines in our pollinators. This comes from the Xerces Society. And by the way, the Xerces Society has a wonderful amount of material about pollinators. And if you're interested in really establishing a pollinator garden or doing any type of management to benefit pollinators, they have the best resources. They probably have the most comprehensive. It's still not, we still could always use more, but that's where right now all the managers are going, is to many of their resources. So, you know, I was like looking at the ladybugs, you know, that to me used to be something that you just wouldn't take for granted, right? That there's always going to be ladybugs. But it's locally extinct from many states. That's sad. It seems like, you know, the ladybug, that's such a prominent insect in our culture, that the idea that that could actually go extinct. Now, there's plenty of other types of lady beetles, but the iconic, I guess, 9-spotted lady beetle has gone locally extinct from some areas. The same with, of course, many of our native bees have declined, mostly due to habitat loss. and then also food sources. This was something I talk about because, as I mentioned, if you lose the pollinator, you can lose the plant, right? And vice versa. So I just find this fascinating because, see, here's a moth, and it feeds from a ghost orchid. See that long proboscis? It's just really cool. And you know, they've evolved over millennia with that relationship. So it's very hard for those pollinators to adapt to something else. They have been evolved with that particular plant and flower. So if that flower disappears, then it's very hard for them to move on to something else. So certainly what we've seen is an increase in the generalist pollinators that can, you know, drink nectar from various different flowers and plants. And the ones that are more specific, those are the ones that tend to be endangered. So these are our types of pollinators that we have: bees, wasps, flies, butterflies and moths, beetles, thrips and ants, birds and bats, all contribute to pollination. Sometimes people forget that, yes, they're pollinating because they're moving pollen around, but they're after the sugar, they're after the nectar. The nectar is their energy source. And so that relates to the quality of your floral resources. A lot of the plants that we breed are no longer high in nectar because we've bred them for some aesthetic trait that usually sacrifices either nectar or pollen production. A lot of them are sterile, right? Because we don't want pollen, because we're allergic to pollen. So understanding that what pollinators need may not fit with the plants that we have. Sorry, I'm kind of skipping ahead, but I'm going to skip through these slides a little bit because I think this goes into all of the bees. And for the sake of time, I don't think I can go into all of them. But just know that all of these are pollinators. And they all have different habits, right? They all have different needs. And so depending on what type you want in your garden, you want to find out what types of pollinators you want to attract. You need to understand their life cycle. Look at that, more than 800 species of moths recorded in Alachua County. So think about a moon garden or a night garden to help with your moth pollinators. People forget that beetles too, and our hummingbirds are also pollinators. Why do pollinators, this is where I wanted to go. They are seeking sugars from the nectar and they want protein from the pollen. Some are more nectar feeders and some will do both. And then of course, this is just going over pollination, that, wind pollination, that's what most people think of when they're allergic because that's the stuff that's swirling around in the wind. But actually the insect pollinated, the pollen tends to, it can drift, but most of it is being moved with the pollinators. So for pollinators, not all flowers are created equal or equally appealing. The amount and access to nectar will be a significant, it will be significant in whether the pollinator visits it. I love this picture. Does anybody know what that plant is on top, the blue with the bee? It's a bird of paradise. And that bee is robbing the nectar. So if you've ever looked at a bird of paradise flower, the natural pollinator of that sits at the end, I think it's a bird, sits on that and weighs it down. And when it weighs it down, you see it pops up. It pops up to a little pollinator. So the bees can't do that. They're not big enough, but they can find the nectaries in there in the bird of paradise. So they're looking for landing pads and the length, as we talked about, the length of their proboscis, that's got to fit. Landing pads are important because these insects are flying around and they need places of rest, just like we need stops along the turnpike, right? Our rest areas. As I mentioned, some common ornamentals may be very colorful and attractive, but may not offer that quality pollen or nectar. And those are usually, if you think of like gardenias or roses, if they're double or triple petals, it's very hard for the pollinator to get into where the pollen is because there's so many petals. And they're bred that way. And oftentimes, as I mentioned before, when they breed for certain aesthetic traits, they can lose the quality of the pollen and nectar. I'm going to go through these really quick too because for time. Composites, the Asteraceae, the daisy family, these are all very popular. And I encourage you, if you're going to start a pollinator garden, the Coreopsis, the blanket flower, those are all good places to start. They offer a landing pad. They're actually multiple flowers. That's why they're called a composite flower. So they have multiple places that they can get nectar from all in one stop. And then these other bowl-shaped flowers, these attract different types, especially the beetles that kind of bumble around in there. They want those shallow bowl-shaped flowers. The umbrella type, so think about your parsley, as well your milkweed. These are nice. Again, they offer a lot of flowers, but there's that landing pad for the insects. These are usually your legumes. They're kind of cool because they offer that little landing pad in the front, and then they go in, and a lot of times you'll see bumblebees, just their little butts, bumblebee butts sticking out because they're going down into the nectaries. But the mint family and the legume family have these types of flowers. Often they're specialized, and oftentimes only certain sized pollinators can get in there. We have the tubular that the hummingbirds tend to like, as well as moths, because they have those long, the only way they can get to the nectaries is if they have a long tongue or a long proboscis. So this is kind of a summary of the different plants that they like and the different colors as well. So birds and bees and wasps, they all see different colors than we do. So they will be attracted to different things. And that's why having a diversity of color, as well as types of flowers, colors, including seasonality, those are all important for attracting many different types of pollinators. This is going over kind of reviewing that. This is what they call a pollination syndrome. It's not my favorite word because syndrome, in my mind, I think of disease or sickness, but this is a way that they categorize what, and I think this is, forget the reference for this one, but this is a national publication where they basically give they have a table of all the descriptions of the flowers. This is a fun activity to do with youth as well as adults to see what you have in your yard, and you can kind of see what visits it and if it kind of follows this table. So when you're wanting to encourage visiting, pollinators, particularly bees, they'll learn flower patterns, the color, whether they're accessible or not, and then they come back. For social bees, they'll come back and they'll communicate that to the hive. For solitary insects, they'll learn that behavior so that they can repeatedly go out to those areas. So when you're designing your pollinator garden, you want to think about grouping plants together. So not having one plant spread out. You kind of want to clump them together. That's going to make it more efficient for the pollinators. And then, of course, that diversity in diet. There's a lot on here on this slide. Again, you're looking for the larger floral display. That's going to draw them in. You want to group the plantings, plant them in clumps, group them together. Creating strata or layers too. So don't forget about your trees and your shrubs. They can act as pollinator plants as well. And oftentimes the trees and shrubs will bloom at different times than your flowers. So they can offer that seasonal floral resource. So going into the seasonality, you want 12 plus species flowering forbs within an area. This has kind of been the magic number that they found to have consistent pollinator visitation throughout the year. So 3 blooming at any given time, that will ensure that you have something for them to visit. So you can account for that pollinators will forage at different times of year. And I keep emphasizing that clumps apparently, because that's the high floral density. This was shared by Dr. Rachel Mallinger for plant preferences varying across pollinators with native and non-native plants. So you can see that even non-native plants have a role for some of these species, whereas wasps tend to really prefer their natives. So they've probably evolved some relationship with those native plants. And so you see that stronger preference for the native plants. But there's plenty of blue turquoise on there too. So non-native plants can certainly play a role, and they can augment those native populations. And then this is a bunch of different plants and what they were visited by. And so look at that basil. Those honeybees really liked that basil. I'm not sure why she has some of those things. Because those were the only things that they visited. So those other bees, the beach sunflower was only visited by those other bees, not the honeybees. And Wendy's, what does that say? Wendy's wish salvia was only visited by bumblebees. Although there seems to be some other things that were only visited by certain species. But I found that kind of interesting that they all kind of have their preferences. And if you've ever had honey that's been made from honeybees that have just visited basil, it's very dark, it has a very interesting flavor. Anyway, that we found that with our beehives in Hawaii. So these are also some Florida trees and shrubs. Like I said, I don't want to forget about them because they offer some pollinators as well. And you want to find out when they're blooming. Here are some examples of that. Now, the chase tree is kind of now, it's not being encouraged because there's a potential for it to escape into natural areas because it's not a native. But man, I love the chase tree. Man, does it attract pollinators. So we'll have to keep monitoring that, but they are seeing chase tree kind of moving about. But so far, it's still safe. It's just that's one thing that they've started to notice. Sparkleberry is also one of my favorites. And then you have your wildflowers. And I'm sharing this presentation so you can access it. The bee balm is one of my favorites. But these are all great pollinator flowers. So some Florida-friendly landscaping tips. As we mentioned, same thing. Not only do you want to provide the pollen resources, the plant resources, but think about water and shelter too. So if you understand the life, basically the needs of those insects. So where do they lay where do they create their nests? What type of plants do you need? Host plants do you need for their young? If you have that in it as well, you'll attract even more. And then, of course, very importantly is to minimize the use of pesticides. This is the biggest challenge with a lot of these areas, is that, remember, pesticides don't care. If it's a broad-based insecticide, it's not going to matter. It doesn't care whether it's a pollinator or a pest. So think about systemics will be taken up by the plant. So anything that visits that plant's flower at that time when it's been treated will get a dose of that pesticide. So think about when you apply your insecticide. I tend to say that contact Contact insecticides are better because they're more selective, and oftentimes you can find things that target certain species. So that way you're limiting collateral damage or limiting the impacts on your pollinators. And then what I find fascinating is once you build up the pollinators and your beneficial insect populations, you usually don't have to control things. And really it's as I mentioned before, it's managing your expectations that there's always going to be some amount of herbivory, there's always going to be some level of pest, because you have to have a level of pest for the biological predator to feed on it. Otherwise, they go away, right? If you don't have anything there. So you have to have food for them. So that's why we really emphasize trying to create those balanced systems. Think about the whole web of that insect. What does it need to complete its life cycle? And if you can include all those components, then you have a more balanced system. These are some of our Florida-friendly landscape pollinator garden resources. They have a butterfly garden app. They have a bee garden app. Can be right on your phone, or you can go to the website and they have it there as well. These are some additional resources from IFAS. And then I hope I'm within time if anybody wants to ask any questions, but thank you so much. This is always a fun talk to give.
You might be able to stay around for a few minutes to answer.
Yes, I would be happy to stay around for a little bit to answer any questions. I can't stay for lunch. I have to get back. We still have to finish with our greenhouses, but there's always a fire to put out somewhere.
Are there some questions? I might ask one.
Sure.
And I'll say our management sometimes likes the manicured look. There have been efforts to create wildflower pollinator gardens here. At one of at the UF Cancer Center and medical facilities at Gale Lemeround Drive and Archer Road, there's an impressive, I don't know, it's a half acre or something of tick seed and gaillardia. It's fantastic. I wonder, how did they manage that, and how was that, I don't know, socially accepted?
They probably have had to, whoever they hire to weed it has to hand weed. So when I was at the conference, we were talking about that unless you're mowing at certain times to kind of reset things, you really have to hand weed because you can't apply herbicides, right? So you have to find a company that's willing to exchange their mowing for hand weeding. And they did find, Dr. Gail Hansen did a study on her design plots and found that the time is about the same. She had 2 experimental plots, one that was a traditional landscape and one that was more Florida friendly with more pollinator plants in it. And what they found is that the time is the same in the management, but it's what you're doing. Either you're mowing or you're hand weeding. And the challenge is the guys tend to want to mow more than they want to hand weed. So
Hi, thanks very much. We here at Oak Hammock have some rather poorly maintained lawns. And I'm sorry, this is the head of the lawn, but they are. And I've been very impressed by the diversity of plants that are it's mowed, but nobody seems to be paying too much attention to it. And so there are empty spaces, but there's a great diversity of very tiny flowers, little bitty yellow flowers and white flowers, and I don't know what they all are. But, and then there's little tiny moths or other very small flies and things that are coming to the, I mean, I'm talking really small flowers. And I think that's something that we might also think about is the sort of micro pollinating environments that we could perhaps do more to maintain, because seems like there's quite a few little moths, little tiny moths that are, and little bitty butterflies.
Yeah, there's been studies looking at the pollination value of lawns, because we're really looking from aesthetic purpose, especially for residential backyards, you're looking at it to be green, right? So as long as you can mow it, it looks green, you're probably okay with it. Now, there's some people that are like, man, I want 100% St. Augustine or whatever. But if it's green, most people can't tell what that green is. And so you can implement things like no mow May, which is a popular thing now, to in May, just don't mow your lawn, so that it can go to flower and it can provide these resources. Not only the flowering, but there's a lot of nesting and stuff that happens within the thatch and within the underneath of the grass. Right now we haven't mowed ours coming out of winter yet, and I have fleabane, I have a bunch of different flowering weeds that I'm leaving, because I know they have a seasonality to them. They'll pop up and then they go back down. And so we probably won't mow. We'll probably mow closer to May, but we're kind of, I guess, doing a no mow April. But so there are definitely strategies. And I think what I tell folks is that if you want a part of your lawn that's manicured, then designate an area for that, and then leave other areas that are less managed that can promote those areas of refuge. So you can have both. You can have like a mosaic of different managed areas that can still support pollinators. Even with mowing, yes. And mowing might be necessary, as I mentioned before, to create habitat for some of these species that are many of these wildflowers are used to, they're what we call ruderal species. They come in after a disturbance in a natural area, right? So they need full sun. They're used to not having a lot of shade. So if we want to encourage those environments, we have to maintain that, right? A meadow will eventually become shrubs and trees and eventually a forest. So if we want to maintain it at a meadow level, then we're going to have to mow or do something to keep the trees from coming in. Oh, okay, right here with the mic. Yep.
Thank you. Are hummingbirds the only birds that are really useful in pollination? What about like other backyard birds?
That's a good question. I'm not a bird expert. I know about the hummingbirds because most of the other birds are eating insects. That's their main source of food, and berries and other things. So, but hummingbirds specifically feed on nectar. So that's why they're considered a pollinator, because that is their sole food source. And they have the tongue and physicality
Right.
to be able to do it.
Okay.
Birds mostly have beaks that are for crushing, and so from
Okay.
that amount of knowledge, I don't know of another. There's probably maybe some other nectar drinking bird, but that's the one that
Okay.
I know of. Yeah.
I've spent some time in Vermont, and they've asked people not to, to put in these and not to mow here, and if you have any water. And what they did was they told signs to put up. They didn't give you the signs, but they said, put this on your signs for explaining. And then they put that explanation out to the public and said, if you see something like this, this is why. And it really helped.
Yeah. Back to one of the first beginner slides where it had those 5 things that are needed to, if we are going to encourage these pollinator in these urban green areas. And one of them is education, right? And that's really my role, is to educate and inform people so they can value those pollinators. And you're right, signage, any form of way we can communicate that value. Once people know, they're like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Any other questions? And no questions online. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Cynthia.
You're very welcome. Thank
I-
you.
And Cynthia said she could hang around for a few minutes, but she's not able to stay for lunch and has to go back and repair things.